Korean-American writer Maurene GOO has been causing young hearts to flutter in recent years with her YA romance novels featuring Korean-American protagonists. 2 titles will be coming to our screens soon as well, as they've been picked up by Netflix to be adapted into feature films, including I Believe in a Thing Called Love, which was also recently published in Korean. In addition to that, she's also been writing for the comic giant Marvel for their Korean-American superhero Silk. To talk to her about these projects and works, I'm glad to say that Maurene GOO joins us now via video for Touch Base and Seoul. Ms. GOO, hello and welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you with us. Can you first tell us a little bit about yourself to our listeners? I understand you are a second-generation Korean-American. How did you get into writing? Where did it come from for you?
Well, the writing kind of was a journey. I've always loved books and reading. So ever since I was a little kid, I loved reading, and my parents really encouraged this love of reading. I was allowed to read anything I wanted. I was allowed to buy books. They weren't big on buying toys, but they always bought me books, took me to the library. So they really, they saw reading as something positive. I don't know if they ever saw it being something I ever do as a career. And in fact, I never considered it as a career until I was much older. I was always good at writing essays and that sort of thing in school, and always encouraged by my English teachers to pursue some sort of writing path. And it's funny. My mother used to be a journalist. She was actually a radio announcer on KBS.
Right, okay.
Yeah, I told her about this. I was like, "Oh my gosh, mom! Like now I'm legitimate." But so my mom was a journalist when I was little, so I always knew that was a path that you could take if you liked writing. So I did a lot of journalism in high school. I was, one of the editors of my high school newspaper. And then when I graduated, I decided to go to college to study journalism and join the newspaper and everything. But then I quickly realized I'm not a journalist. I don't like doing research. I'm really bad at keeping to facts. I find current events like really not my interests, where my
Sure.
interests lay. So I was like, okay, what else can I do? So it took me a while. I, graduated college with 0 life skills, except I like to read books. And so I worked at a bookstore. And then basically, like in my early 20s, I started writing a little bit here and there. And then I decided to go to grad school so that I could kind of hone in on a skill,
Sure.
and take something from my writing and try to figure out what I could do with it. And I decided to study children's book editing, or editing, publishing in general.
Mm.
And then I always loved children's books. But when I was applying to grad schools, I applied to several grad schools, and one of them was the new school, um, the children's writing. I forget the exact title, but it's like
Okay,
writing for
sure.
children, And then so I did a sample for them, and that's when I started writing YA. And after I graduated grad school, I did all sorts of jobs, but I kept writing my first YA novel,
Mm.
and it eventually got published. So yeah, writing for me was always there, but not in the form of writing novels until
Sure.
way later in life.
So how did it feel then when you finished your first novel and it got published?
It was a surreal feeling. I think everybody's different when they have this path. For me, I wasn't somebody who dreamed of being a novelist and who pursued it like
Mm.
really diligently. I have to admit, I worked on my book because it was so fun and I
Mm.
enjoyed it. I happened to get an agent, and then, she said, "Okay, we'll try to sell this." And I don't know if I fully believed that would ever happen. I just thought, okay, great. If it happens, awesome. And then it did.
Right.
And it was shocking. I remember I was out in my street. I still live in the same neighborhood, and I was barefoot, obviously, because I was in the house. So when she called me, I was barefoot. And then I just ran out into the street and I was like, oh my God, just kind of screaming. I don't know why I felt like I had to be outside. So it was wonderful. It felt so
Right.
unexpected in a way, but also something that when it happened, I realized, oh, this is something I've always wanted to do. I just never said it out loud.
Right, the house can contain you, it seems. Your books feature Korean American teens trying to find love, but also learning about their identity and Korean culture. Were these stories always in you then, do you feel? And how much of your own story is in these novels?
Yeah, I don't know if these stories were always in me. I feel like every book that comes out is like it almost surprises me too. Like, oh, this is a story I didn't realize I wanted to tell. However, of course, there's a lot of me in my books, especially my first novel, Since You Asked. It was very, um, in a way, lifted from my own life because it was the first novel I was writing, and I did totally take, I wrote what I knew. That's
Mm,
something people, authors like, write what you know. And then
mm,
there's lots of, people argue about whether or not that's actually useful advice. But in my case, it was a easy entryway into writing about, writing new characters based on my life experiences. And then after that, the three books that came after that have been very, not at all close to my life as far as plot, but the main characters and the other characters in the novels always have something of me in there. It's hard to avoid that, especially because when I'm writing about teenage Korean American girls,
mm.
I access my own memories and my experiences and also what I wanted to read as a teenager or even an adult, So it's it's a mix of stuff from my life and
Right.
just stories that come to me that I feel like writing at
How
the
im-
moment.
how important was it for you to write specifically about Korean Americans? Was it uh, an ambition, a choice to try and promote representation, or was it more about just writing about what you know, as you said?
Yes and no. Um, you know, my first novel, for sure, I was like, why wouldn't I write about a Korean American girl? Like, it just didn't occur to me. Why would I write about some, like, let's say a white person, right? It's just not, would anybody ever ask, like, a white author, why are you writing about white people? It's just like, it's just kind of like,
Sure.
yeah, it's what I'm doing. And it's what I know. Like I said, I was trying to lift a little bit from my own life. But after that, I have been consciously writing a lot of Korean American characters because, again, I feel like there's an endless amount of experiences and stories that are in me, and they could be all sorts of people, but I truly understand the Korean American experience, right? So I feel like there are so many facets to that experience that you can explore. It's really rich
Mm,
still. And if you read my books, like, yeah, there are I put a lot of Korean pop culture or Korean American experiences, but the books are actually very much just about different teenage experiences and feelings and emotions. So I just make my characters Korean American, and then, that's just part of the fabric of their story. I try to make it feel natural rather than like focusing on what it means to be Korean American. I will never really explore that except in my latest book, actually. But I do in a way that I think is pretty cool.
sure. I think giving the plotline to one of your books gives a good sense of what to expect. For example, your second book, I Believe in a Thing Called Love, published in 2017, is about a high school student who decides to use the rules of K-drama romance plot points to try and get a boyfriend. It sounds fun and engaging, and there's a cheekiness, I think, there as well, poking a little bit of fun at cheesy Korean dramas. As I mentioned as well, this book has recently been published in Korean. What did you make of your book being published in Korea? Because I imagine that you didn't originally write it for a Korean audience as such.
I was so excited because I've been waiting my whole writing career. So I've been doing this since I sold my first book in 2011, I think, and I've just been waiting. Like, I have a lot of, especially I believe in a thing called Love, has a lot of foreign sales, different translations. But I was sitting there waiting for the Korean one, and Korean publishers are tough nut to crack. I feel like they're very picky. So I was like, okay, maybe they don't really want to hear about Korean American experiences because it doesn't resonate, and or it's just not doesn't feel different enough or something. I don't know what it was. I was like, oh gosh,
Mm.
I guess maybe my books are just not like a popular in Korea. But I believe in a thing called Love. I had always hoped specifically that book would would be published in Korea because it is my homage, my love letter to Korean dramas, which are a huge connection for me to my Korean identity, growing up in the US. I watched K dramas since I was a child. The Korean parents in the US, they would get these bootleg VHS cassette. This is making me look really old, but they would get VHS tapes. I would go to the video store with my grandma, with my parents, pick them up. My parents always had them on. And then, they got kind of cooler when I was in high school, when I had a lot of Korean American friends that liked K dramas. Then, at some point when I went to grad school in Boston, I was very homesick for LA and Korean people because Boston is very homogenous.
Mm.
And I found like a little DVD, Korean DVD rental place. I would rent the DVDs and they don't have, English subtitles. And I would watch them with my white friends and I would just sit there and translate for them. But, my Korean is not that good. So I would kind of be like, ah, they're talking about this. I don't understand. But yeah, basically
Sure.
it's emotional, and so I really hoped that this book would find a home in Korea. And so I'm so thrilled. And I hope that it feels authentic to Korean dramas. But more than that, like, I hope it gives a little insight into like how Korean dramas can play a role in our
Mm.
lives here in the US.
Now, I Believe in a Thing Called Love has also been picked up by Netflix to be made into a feature film. This follows another novel of yours, Somewhere Only We Know, that was picked up by the streaming giant as well. How did it learn to how did it feel to learn about the rights having been bought by Netflix? And what can you tell us about how that's all been going?
Um, it's another kind of milestone, like selling getting a translated book in Korea. It's very similar. So for me, the Korean translation is that was a specific dream of mine. But every author wants their books to be adapted. It's like, even the ones that play it cool, I'm like, give me a break. It'd be amazing to see these worlds and characters you created on screen and share it with a larger audience. Like, for me, that's always been the thing. I want my books to reach as many people as possible. And so I was so thrilled. So Somewhere Only We Know was sold first, and it is being adapted by a wonderful Korean American writer, Lana Cho, who's done a lot of television work. And Somewhere Only We Know is her first feature. And then I Believe in a Thing Called Love was also sold after, and the writer who is adapting that is Yuling Kwang. So it's just really awesome to watch the process of, seeing them become a different medium and hopefully, we'll find an audience one day and hope people will be able to watch it. It's been so cool, a cool experience.
Sure, we also have to try and squeeze in the fact that you've been writing for Marvel's Korean American superhero Silk. Can you tell us about that opportunity and what that experience has been like?
Yeah, so I wrote a 5 issue run last year, I believe. Gosh, time is what is time anymore? But I wrote that when I was pregnant during the pandemic, and so it was such a special and a weird time for me. It was such a great experience, you know. So Silk had a 20 something issue run or two runs before, 7 years prior. Sorry, I'm probably getting these years wrong, but it was quite a bit of time. And then they wanted to, you know, relaunch Silk with a Korean American writer. So I was contacted by the editor at the time, Jake Thomas, and you know, I had just decided to take a break from writing books. I just wanted like a little breather, and I had a feeling I was going to have a baby too. And so when I got that opportunity, I was like, yes, because for so many reasons. One, I've always loved comics. I've always been interested, like maybe I'll write a comic one day. I just don't know when I'll have the opportunity. And then it kind of like landed in my lap. Two, my favorite superhero, not just Marvel, is Spider-Man, and Silk is part of the Spider-Verse.
Sure.
She was bit by the same spider that Peter Parker was, and so you know she has basically Spider-Man-ish abilities. Actually, she has some cooler powers too. Um, and she's Korean American, which is like what I, if you had told 10-year-old me, I used to read the Amazing Spider-Man in my, you know, town newspaper, and you're like, oh, you're going to write a Korean American version of Spider-Man one day. I'd be like, what are you even talking about? Does that exist? So it was awesome. I loved the experience. My team was amazing. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to do the second. They hadn't, you know, it did really well. And so they wanted to move on to a few more issues, but I had to bow out because of my schedule. But another wonderful Korean American writer, Emily Kim, I think took over that. And
Sure.
she's also TV and maybe feature writer. I'm
Sure.
not sure, but she does TV. So yeah.
We're running out of time. Very briefly, what's next for you? I understand there is another YA novel coming, set to be released in 2023, I believe, involving time travel.
Yes. So this book is called Throwback. It will come out at the moment. We're saying April next year. I don't know the exact date yet. It is another young adult novel, and it's I've always wanted to write a mom book. If you're noticing, if you're watching Asian American media, there's a lot of stuff coming out between stories of Asian women and their mothers. And I am one of them. It's just something is in the air, you know, but it's really because all of us are now old enough to tell the stories. And so it's an Asian American, Korean American girl in a suburb of LA, which is very much like the suburb I grew up in Glendale. And she does not get along with her mom, and they get into a huge fight. And she is abandoned by her mom. She doesn't have a ride to school, so she calls a ride share. And it comes to pick her up, and then she ends up going back to school in 1995 when her mother was in school. So really like a very interesting story to me because it's not very typical. It's about a second generation, you know, teenage girl, and then her mom's first generation growing up in the mid 90s in the US. So it's very much about like
Sure.
what gets passed along, you know, generationally, the further removed you are from immigrating in the US, what gets lost and saved, you know, between generations, and then you know the strength of mother-daughter relationships. But there's also like a time travel romance, and there's a lot of humor, but it will make you cry.
Okay, we'll keep that in mind. Well, it was an absolute pleasure to have you on the show today. We'll be speaking to writer Maurene GOO. Thank you for your time today, and we look forward to more of your books and for them to be appearing on screen soon as well.
Thank you so much for having me.